So as many of you know, Andrei is the founder and executive director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. It's a Brussels-based think tank that does really excellent research and consultation, mostly on European climate policy. He's also held roles in international climate negotiations and led numerous private sector organizations and associations, including IETA. ERCST launched a project evaluating design options for a border carbon adjustment in November 2019. That project mostly came to a close with a report published in September 2020 that you can find on ERCST's website. Andrei was a co-author of that report, and we'll be focusing on this work in our conversation. Maybe let's start with a wider lens first, so setting the context. Where are we globally with climate mitigation efforts? Where are we headed? And what's the relationship between those dynamics and this border carbon adjustment idea?
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be with ICAP and AIDA. Now, I think that we're beginning to see finally where we're heading. I think that for a little while after March, when the bottom fell off the UNFCCC process because of the COVID-related measures, nobody quite knew where we're coming or going. Obviously, cancellation of kind of not the only, but what was the spine of the climate change world for many, which was the UNFCCC negotiation, post-Paris, the rule book, and then a lot of things that were supposed to happen in Glasgow kind of stopped, and we didn't know whether we're coming, whether starting or not starting. What we've seen though now for the last few weeks is really a testimony that things are continuing to move, and not only move but to accelerate. In the end, we are in the framework of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a promise. The Paris Agreement is about a bunch of countries making promises, then trying to explain to each other how they were going to make good on those promises, and that's a nationally determined contribution. And then they all have to add up to this global goals, which is the dual goal of as close to 1.5 and carbon neutrality in the second half. What we've seen of the century, what we've seen though for the last few weeks, months, is an acceleration. We've seen Japan, China, Republic of Korea beginning to make statements about carbon neutrality 2060, 2050. So this is a very good sign. I think that we are in the absence of the entry to force of the Doha amendments. These are positive signs. And it tells you that we are moving into an increasing level of ambition globally. Now, whether that level of ambition globally is adding up to what we need to be under 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 as possible is something that the global stocktake was going to tell us. And that global stocktake now, all of a sudden, because Glasgow has been postponed by a year, is going to take an increasing importance at the Glasgow talks. So all this is moving us into the direction of, yes, we see a lot of countries kind of moving their cap or their ambition higher or the cap lower. What we know though is that the asymmetry continues to exist. Clearly the EU is going to 2050 to carbon neutrality. As such, intermediate milestone in 2030 will be in the order of 55 to 60% probably. I don't think that's quite matched by everybody else. I think that the other pledges are a lot more imprecise. So that keeps an asymmetry in climate effort between now and then. And as somebody said, in the long term, we're all dead. But in the term between now and 2030, what us in ERCST, and we assume the Commission and the member state want a decarbonized Europe, but they don't want a deindustrialized Europe. And this is where this whole idea of the border carbon adjustment or some kind of adjustment. We don't know with a CBAM. CBAM is like a Walmart, it's a big box thing. Nobody quite knows what it is, but this is where the CBAM comes in, because we continue to have this asymmetry. Don't forget also that the asymmetry was brought up about a year ago when things were different.
Mm. Yeah, as the sort of the conversation seems to have heated up as climate neutrality, goals of climate neutrality are setting in, along with the sort of intermediate, stepped up 2030 ambition and continued asymmetry, a need to do something about the carbon leakage problem with more constraints on free allocation and all of those things, and continued leakage concerns. What was then ERCST's approach to this work on BCAs and sort of the objective of this project?
Well, look, we there was, ERCST has tried to have the conversation in Brussels on border carbon adjustment for the last 3-4 years. And every time, we were part at some point of a broader organization called ICTSD, the International Center of Trade and Sustainable Development. Now we are a self-standing think tank. But as being part of ICTSD, we were preoccupied with trade. Trade was important. So we looked at BCAs in Brussels, and every time we did that, we got slapped on the wrist, if you can call it that. The institutions were not super happy that we are bringing border carbon adjustment. The motto was, why you guys kind of stirring the pot? Don't you have something better to do? Are you running out of ideas? Now, lo and behold, no, that's God's honest truth. But lo and behold, all of a sudden, the political commitment changed. And President von der Leyen decided that this was something that she wanted to throw in the pot when she was in the middle of the nominations and the political mandate and so on. And the institution changed, weapon from one shoulder to the other and marched forward. So all of a sudden, this has become the flavor of the day. Now, from our point of view, we always thought it was necessary to look at this because it was quite clear that free allocation at some point is going to start running into problems. If this increasing up, it was going to run into problems at some point with this rapidly increasing ambition, which sounds a little bit like a bidding process. It's quite clear that upcoming problem is being accelerated. The timetable is being accelerated. So we felt that with our preoccupation with ETS, with our preoccupation with how is this going to work, how are we going to keep an industrial Europe, we thought, how do we deal with this? And nobody's had any better idea until somebody put on the table the border carbon adjustment. The question is, and this is a long answer, Chris, the question is, what is the objective of the border carbon adjustment?
Well, and also your guys' approach to analyzing it, ultimately, what did you want to clarify in the debate?
Well, look, we, like all good think tanks and consultant organization, it's Act 1 and Act 2. So Act 1 was very much an analysis of options, issues and options. And we basically split or unpacked a BCA, because initially we started with the BCA. We unpacked the BCA into 9 components: the kind of instrument, the geographic scope, the coverage, the sectoral scope, the all kind of thing, and then we judged them by 5 criteria: environmental integrity, carbon competitiveness, WTO compliance, administrative. So there 9 columns and 5 rows, and kind of try to analyze to see what are the options and which one is green, which one is yellow, which one is red. So that was kind of the initial thought. The second part of it, what came, Chris, is that we realized as we worked is that this is not going to be a silver bullet. And then we started looking at this in a framework together with other solutions, maybe complementary, maybe competing, consumption charges, contract for difference, standards, and we kind of discovered a much more complex world.
Mm. And so from ICAP's own kind of work on the border carbon adjustments issue, there's often this tension between what you can achieve in terms of what the instrument addresses and competitiveness and leakage, and then the other side of what's feasible in terms of the WTO stuff and just administratively. Um, I know you guys also looked at various scenarios for this across these 9 dimensions and these 5 criteria. Could you give me a sense of what you found in these different scenarios? What were some of the key takeaways or insights you got from kind of diving into what are 3 options?
Well, okay, I think that it was a little bit unfortunate because sometimes what you do something and then doesn't matter what anything else you did, it's everybody focus on one thing, and that happens sometimes. In this case, we did have 3 scenarios. One of them was the kind of what was sounded as the most likely. The other one is a go-getter, and the third one was a possible. And they were not. We didn't mean to say this is the most likely. This is what we favor. We just listening to the noise at the time and say, okay, based on the noise that we hear, this is kind of what we think could happen, likely to happen. Then the go-getter was something, say, the heck with it. I mean, let's do it. We don't care what it is, WTO or no WTO. Let's do the maximum for carbon leakage and competitive. And the third one was, well, the one that is probably the one that could fly that could politically fly the most likely. But what we found is that, I mean, the conclusion that we would have is that the carbon leakage and competitiveness, in the end, the problem of carbon leakage comes from the loss of competitiveness. People leave because they become less competitive or uncompetitive if you stay in the jurisdiction, and then you have carbon leakage. So to separate the two, I know that for WTO purposes, you have to focus on the environmental side, on the carbon leakage side, environment. But I think they are the same. I can say the Commission may not be able to say they're 2 sides of the same coin. In terms of WTO, Chris, I remember until not long ago, until President van der Leyen brought this thing up, it was an article of faith in the community that you could not do this on the WTO. It was an article of faith. You just said, and everybody say, sorry, you can't do this WTO. I think that there probably are ways to do this, but then it gets watered down. I think that in the end, the view that we would take is probably we would in some way break WTO, but we would seek exemptions under Article 20 of GATT for environmental purposes. So that's kind of broadly the conclusion that we found right
now. And you mentioned it, the CBAM or BCA not really being a silver bullet. Do you find that that's kind of, do people kind of put their expectations onto it as being that? Does that seem like a big point that you guys wanted to make a lot? Do you find that that's a common belief among many that this should be the center of like industrial policy going forward?
It's a necessary, maybe not. Look, what we did so far is we had a story to decarbonize electricity, and the measures were put in place. There were incentives, there were feed-in tariffs, there were this, that, and the other thing. So that the story of decarbonizing electricity is there, is successful. And we look at companies like Enel, they're very upfront, others are following. But there is no story for decarbonizing industry, or at least we don't see a coherent story. And this is why what we think that the Green Deal should be. And a necessary condition for this is to deal with the issue of competitiveness and carbon leakage. And whether the adjustment is at the border, which is the border carbon adjustment, or the adjustment is domestic, which is a a consumption charge or a
Mhm.
carbon value added or some sort, carbon added tax, there clearly has to be some adjustment somewhere. Or I think at some point within a very tight, the margins are getting tighter and tighter. The world of trade, the margins are not what they used to be. And like 50 years ago, you could have large margin. Today, everything is very rapid. So within tight margins, that would make a difference. So a solution has to be found. And again, I think the tension is going to be between those who feel that the border carbon adjustment, the adjustment at the border, is a solution. And the big problem there is going to be export.
Mm.
Export is going to be, in my mind, kind of the what in the U.S. Supreme Court you'd call a litmus test, or the adjustment will be done internally through some kind of consumption charge in some form, complemented with contracts of some sort that would cover the difference.
And probably free allocation. If you do the consumption charges, you pair it with the free allocation, right?
You have to pair it with the free allocation. The question is, yes, and this is where the question, we're not at this point, we're not showing our hand, because there is Act 2. There's a second part of the project, which actually we're starting this evening after this call, after this presence with you, is we hear a lot that many in the parliament and others are actually looking to stop free allocation in general. And at the same time, you have a bunch of guys saying, "Oh, like consumption charge, we will have enough free allocation to mute the impact of the ETS." And is that true? First of all, I don't know that there is enough free allocation. First of all, are you in the world where free allocation is acceptable approach? There are people philosophically opposed to that. Second thing is there enough free allocation? If there's not enough free allocation, then you're going to have to start it to take it out of the auctioning part, which goes to the electricity, and which is still there until we decarbonize electricity completely. So there is going to be tension between these, but yes, a necessary condition is the free allocation.
Yeah. And you do see that as there's some, the option is on the table. You see consumption charges as at least on the table at the European level.
We think that there are some very serious players who have, look, the question is, Chris, a bunch of people are going to say, "What do we do now, guys?" And going to look at a bunch of very serious players saying, we don't like adjustment at the border. We think this is dangerous. We think, first of all, it's not going to do everything that we need it to do, not enough. And second thing, this is like it is like a mutual assured destruction. I mean, it's a weapon that you unleash, and you don't know what's going to happen after that. It may work very well. The United States and Europe, under the Biden administration, a Biden administration, both having BCAs, it could very well work. But we don't know. So on the other hand, and the people are afraid of the impact on trade. So there are some very serious parts of industry in Europe for whom this is a very serious option. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I've gotten that sense too, sometimes from industrial players. On that subject of trade partners, you guys had these 8 international town halls with various stakeholders from key trading partners like Russia, South Africa, the US, specifically on the border carbon adjustments again. What were your biggest takeaways from those town halls? What did you find? What were the kind of the common messages that you were hearing from pretty major trading partners? Also Ukraine, Japan.
Well, I tell you what, it's first of all, they were done. Some of them were done before whatever we call summer vacation. So it is another time, another place. things may have changed, so we may have to revisit some of this. The first thing that I would say, there was quite clear knowledge and awareness of the fact this is happening. It's quite surprising. I mean, you do see, Russians, Ukrainians, Turks, Indians, Japanese, Koreans, South Africans, they're very knowledgeable. They know that this is happening. So the first thing is awareness. The second thing is, I would put it in different ways. I think that there is a category which I would put the kind of think tanks, NGOs, civil society, would say, yeah, guys, great. This is forcing our own people to do something. There's a second category, which is the government, especially in the G77, the government, quasi-government, bunch of people who are morally outraged by this. And they say this is not going to happen unless you do this as a cooperative measure, not as a punitive measure. The third part, which is also very interesting, is industry. And industry taking the line is, how do I get out of this? How do I manage the situation? They didn't take or they don't seem to take the line necessarily that you can't do this. It's more like, hey guys, we're doing enough. We're going to be exempt from this. If you take the Ukrainians swear that in their own opinion, they are more or less taking on a lot of the EU environmental commitments and approaches. So we're not EU, but we're like EU when it comes to environment and climate change. So why would we pay for it?
Mm.
We shouldn't have to pay for it. So I think there's different reaction, but the main reaction that one is struck by is the fact that you hear a very, very large awareness of the problem. So this is not something flying under people's radar. It is we run into G77 countries where governments have had discussion with DG Taxud and DG Klima.
Mm.
It's quite, to me, I was a little bit taken aback that they are so rapid in interacting.
Yeah. With our last 5 minutes or so, I guess I wanted to, maybe it's hard to distill this into one, but you had these international consultations. You also had a lot of consultations with stakeholders in the EU, particularly with industry, as part of this work, where you introduced a lot of your analysis. After all that, after all the consultations, both international and in the EU, and having finished this first part of your research, what do you see as the biggest challenge in implementing a BCA? Maybe it's not possible to come up with one issue, but what do you see as the biggest challenges after all of this?
I think people are, in a way, if you want to put it, whether they're conservative or you stick with the devil, or whatever you want to call it. But I think there is a significant amount of reluctance among many to give away something that has worked for them so far. And maybe it's unfair to say that, because maybe it worked by a set of circumstances. So it may be that we had a recession and we had this and that and the other thing, so it worked because of that. But they're reluctant to give up free allocation for something, for a tool on which you put so much hope, but it's never been tested. And the only place that I know it's been tested is in California on electricity, which is not exactly like, this is not like a stage 3 COVID vaccine test. It's one place in a very, very particular jurisdiction. So I would say that many people are making the initial noise, okay, interesting, but I'd like to, we've done a tour of member states, and most of them say, well, yeah, we're not against it, but you're going to have to tell us more before we can really make a judgment. We still don't know enough to make a judgment about us.
Mm. You kind of alluded to kind of a next phase in your work. Could you maybe give us more about your next steps in this area, border carbon adjustments and sort of the other instruments that you guys have been looking at? Like what's next for you?
Well, there's about four strands of work. And the four strands of work, one is kind of following the institution's policy making road. So looking at what's going to come out of the commission in June and so on is fine. We also promised to put forward our proposal for a BCA. I'm talking about BCA, a pure BCA. But I think that the most interesting parts of this, and probably the most challenging, are the fact that we will look at on a sectoral basis and see whether this is doable or it is reasonable for all sectors or individual sector. We will look at the usual suspect, the energy intensive industry, whether it's doable and whether it has its own little quirks that each sector has to be treated in a different way. You know, we're looking at for the people that are very electricity intensive. How do you apply? How do you deal with indirect costs, indirect emissions in a CBAM? And that's not an easy thing to do. Nobody's had a solution so far that I know of. And the second part is, on a temporal basis, we would also like to look at this set of tools in a toolbox, because again, there's BCA, there's contract for difference, there's a consumption charges, there's standards, there's free allocation that is still in the mix somewhere. So how do you progress from these, and whether there is what is the framework? Is there a time progression? Is there different instruments being applied at the EU level, being applied at the member state level, as some EU level? So these are the two main things that we think are going to be quite challenging for us to do, but also interesting.
On the sector specific stuff, I mean, you're under a bit of a tight time frame, right? If you're wanting to sort of influence the European debate, and that proposal is coming out June 2021. That's pretty. Are you guys kind of moving quickly on that?
We move mountains. We're small. You know, somebody used this. It probably doesn't have a good history, but we're small and we try harder.
Yeah.
Yes, we do have to have. Chris, you're totally right. And this is why I'm going to hang up with you. I'm going to go straight into a meeting with our funders.
I know.
Because yes, yeah. we have been. Yes, it has taken a couple of weeks more than we wanted it. We have a very extensive and a very diverse set of people backing us, but we know that by probably between now and May 15, we have to produce stuff, or else it's going to become a lot less relevant after that. After that, it's all propaganda and kind of making it aware and making people know, I mean, disseminating. But we have to produce something between now and March 15. That's kind of the way we look at it.
Yeah. And I'm wishing you guys the best of luck. And thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you guys, and thanks for inviting me.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. I'll let you get to your meeting with the funders.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.